everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's get to it. So tonight we are beginning session number 29, the prelude to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Holy Temple, and at the same time, the rise of Christianity. Very apropos, I guess, for the month of December. So when we concluded last week, we mentioned that Hillel and Shamai were the last of these zugos, the last of this situation where we had two rabbinic leaders of the Jewish community in Israel. Hillel had the position of being the Nasi, the prince, or the head of the Sanhedrin, and Shammai was the Av Beis Din, the second in command of the Sanhedrin. Now, Hillel and Shammai, as we see throughout the Talmud, had very different personalities. Hillel was known as a very calm person. There's a famous section in the Talmud where it says a person wanted to convert to Judaism and was harassing him, and someone made a bet that he couldn't get Hillel upset. And again, all kinds of stories that tell us the character of Hillel was that he was always very calm, a very pleasant person, and never got upset. And this really helped him in his work of trying to solidify the Sanhedrin and the Jewish community as being one that could survive as a nation without a homeland. Because as Herod was ruling, and we'll see his descendants after him, and there's definitely a complete break from the country of Judah and the Jewish religion, the Jewish people, that Hillel is really making tremendous efforts to put everything into place so that we survive as a nation without a physical homeland, to solidify the rule of the Sanhedrin. And because he was such a nice guy, not one to take on fights, always pleasant, always wanted to make friends, because of that, even Herod didn't feel threatened by him. So he was able to do what he was trying to do without the threat of Herod, because Herod didn't see any significance in him or what he was doing. So that's our famous Hillel. On the flip side, we had his partner, Shammai. Shammai had the reputation of being what we would call a kanai, a little bit of a religious fanatic, in a good way, but still a religious fanatic. Now, this is true in his latter academy, the Academy of Shammai, where they would often take on stringent halachic positions. But even in the country of Judah, they were a more nationalistic than the school of Hillel, and we see that they would regularly fight against the presence of Rome, the culture of Rome, in the state of Israel, the state of Judah. One such story was that before Herod died, there was a rumor that went out that he had died. And when the students of Shammai hear about this, they go to the Beis Hamikdash, they go to the temple, and as we mentioned last week, when the temple was refurbished by Herod, he put a Roman eagle on top of the main entrance to show the loyalty and deference to Rome. The eagle was the symbol of Rome. And these students of Shammai, thinking that Herod is gone, go and tear the eagle down. Well, lo and behold, Herod wasn't really dead. He was just sick. He did survive. And needless to say, these students of Shammai get punished in a major way. They get burnt at the stake. And not only that, Herod has the leaders of all of the families of the Jewish community arrested. And he gives directive to his sister that on the day that he dies, all of these leaders should be put to death, so that his day of death, Herod's day of death, would be a day of mourning. Luckily, on the day that he really dies, his sister, who was somewhat more benevolent than he, did not inform the community that Herod was dead. She first made sure all of these Jewish leaders were released, and only later did they find out that Herod had actually died, and therefore the leaders were spared. So that's the atmosphere, that's the culture of the country after the rule of Herod. The rabbis, the Perushim, the Sanhedrin, all working, these are all synonymous terms, Hillel, Shammai being the leadership. We're working on taking the religion completely out of the state, and Rome is completely in control of the state. Now, after Herod dies, as usually happens in these time periods, there was a dispute in his will. Now, it seems that Herod had given over his estate, had designated his son Herod Archelaus to be the leader in his place after he passed away. But there were certain claims of another one of his sons, Herod Antipas. Yes, he had like 3 or 4 sons named Herod. As we said before, the guy was a total narcissist, liked to use his name over everything. So many of his children had the name Herod, and then were given a second name, because it gets pretty confusing if at home everyone's name is Herod. good. So we had Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas, who were vying for the throne that their father had possessed. And both of them go to Rome to appeal to Augustus Caesar. And in the end, what happens is Augustus appoints Herod Archelaus not as the king. They take away the title king, and they call him the ethnarch, or the governor of Judah, because Augustus was a smart man, and he saw in Archelaus certain traits that could cause problems. So Rome basically jumps in, takes more of the rule of the country, and gives Herod's son Archelaus the job of being the governor, no longer the king. Now, Herod Antipas, the other brother who was vying for the throne, is given the job of being the tetrarch of the Galilee. Tetrarch was after the ethnarch, after the governor in the Roman government. You had 4 tetrarchs, 4 assistant or vice governors that were in charge of different regions of the country, and Herod Antipas is given the Galilee. Now, interestingly enough, after Augustus Caesar passes away, his successor in Rome is somebody by the name of Tiberius. And when Herod Antipas is the tetrarch in the Galilee, he names the city that we now know in Hebrew as Tiberias. He names it after the Emperor Tiberius as showing his deference to him, and that's how we got a city named for a Roman emperor in Israel. It's a great city, by the way. I love the city. It's one of my favorite cities, but that's why it is named for a Roman emperor. Okay, so after Herod, we have Herod Archelaus, who is the ethnarch of the country, and he seems to have all of the bad qualities of Herod with none of the good qualities. Case in point, story that Josephus tells us is one year when the Jews come to Jerusalem for Passover, for what we call the Aliyah L'Regel, for the Passover pilgrimage. Herod Archelaus doesn't like the fact that they have not shown him respect, that they have not been, so to speak, on his side. So what does he do? He has tens of thousands of Jews slaughtered in the temple who come for the Passover service. And, that was kind of the relationship between him and the Jews in Judea. Now, at this point, Augustus is still alive, and the Jews appeal to him in Rome, saying that, this guy, Herod Archelaus, is crazy. Look at what he did. He just slaughtered thousands of your subjects on our holiday. We got to do something about him. And Augustus Caesar agreed, and he at that point further limited the rule of Herod Archelaus until eventually he will be sent into exile and after 10 years of his rule. So the Jewish community gets their way, they get rid of Herod Archelaus, but what happens in his stead is Rome takes an even more direct control or more direct role in the governance of Israel. This is the beginning of our non-Jewish Roman ethnarchs or Roman governors, the most famous of which comes from Christianity, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight, being Pontius Pilate. And one thing that we have to know is one is worse than the next. They all have the goal of just coming in and grabbing for themselves, grabbing whatever wealth they can, not doing anything for the country, for sure not doing anything for the Jews. And that's the situation Israel finds itself in after Herod. 10 years later, after his son Herod Archelaus, Rome's in control through these ethnarchs, non-Jewish ethnarchs, and it's really the beginning of anarchy. We already said the religion is separate, Rome's in control, but the governors are just vying for money, vying for wealth, and it is just a situation that is on a crash course for destruction at this point. Now, in the year 9, Hillel Hazaken, the great Hillel the Nasi, passes away. What's interesting is this is the end of the time period of Zugos, of having 2 leaders. We'll see from now on, as long as there are Jews in Israel, there is only one leader. And that leader, quite simply, has the name Nasi, and it is always in the family of Hillel. So we'll see from Hillel on, this position of Nasi, prince, is always the descendants of Hillel. So the one who becomes the Nasi after Hillel is Shimon ben Hillel. And then his son, the grandson of Hillel, is Rabban Gamliel. Now, Rabban Gamliel is very famous as a Nasi. We'll talk about him a lot as we go on. And one of the reasons he's most famous is, again, continuing the role of his grandfather. He starts the process of writing the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah won't be written down until 150 years later, but the process of organizing that eventually become the Mishnah, that starts at this time with Rabban Gamliel. Now, the confusing thing about the family of Hillel is that after Rabban Gamliel, after first Shimon and then his son Rabban Gamliel, virtually all of the children are either named Shimon, Gamliel, or Hillel. Right? So we'll have we now have Rabban Gamliel, then we'll have his son Shimon ben Gamliel, and then we'll have his son Gamliel ben Shimon, and then we'll have a Hillel thrown in here, and it's hard to figure out who's who, which one's son, grandson, which one's Gamliel the first, second, third, but we know that they're all descendants of Hillel. They all have the position of being the Nasi. And the last point we need to know about them is they are all descendants of the house of David. Hillel was a descendant of David HaMelech, King David, and therefore this position of being Nasi in part now becomes the heir apparent, meaning that if Judaism can be restored and control, or I should say Jewish control can be restored in the country, then this Nasi will take the position as the king, as the Mashiach, as the anointed one, and therefore it also plays into what we'll get to shortly in our discussion of the rise of Christianity, about one of the many reasons we know that Yashka, that Jesus could not have been a Jewish Messiah, could not have even been considered as a Jewish Messiah, is because, according at least to the Christian church, he was living at the same time when there was already a Nasi. And the Nasi, descending from Hillel, descending from David, was the heir apparent. So if there's already a community position as an heir apparent to the throne, how all of a sudden is this guy Yashka over here, Jesus, how does he have a claim to the throne? We'll get to that momentarily. But at least this is the time period where we see the zugos, the pairs are done. Now it's just the Nasi, and it's all direct line in the family of Hillel, which is a direct line from the family of David. Okay. So we mentioned before that after Augustus Caesar, we have the next Caesar, the next emperor of Rome, is somebody by the name of Tiberius. Now, Tiberius was an adopted son of Augustus. We're going to see the next few emperors are like adopted sons. They're all within the family, but he was an adopted son of Augustus, and he is our next Roman emperor that we're going to have to deal with over here. And what's interesting is so we already mentioned how he got Tiberius named after him, but we need to mention another phenomenon in the Roman Empire to understand what happens in Judah at this point. So Rome was this vast empire, and one of the ways that they would try and maintain control over their empire with this situation of ethnarchs and tetrarchs and all these different government officials is they would always bring their kids to Rome. In a certain level, they were captives, but they were royal captives. In other words, they were treated as part of the royal family, the government family in Rome, and all of the government children were raised together in school, therefore preventing rebellion of the different governors throughout the empire, and making it that the children were very indoctrinated in Roman culture, and that they all became friendly at a young age, and they grow up together, and they're educated together, and that is what we see happens with the family of Herod. So Herod, it being, as we mentioned before, he knocked off many of his children, all of his children that he felt posed a threat to himself. He just knocks off. And we see that one of his sons that he knocks off is, we already mentioned last week that he knocks off all of the sons of Miriam, so all the descendants of the Maccabees. But one of his, but in his family, that all the descendants of the Maccabees through Miriam were knocked off. Miriam was killed, but he has a wife who is a wife who's a Samaritan. So as we mentioned before, they're not so good Samaritans. They're not Jewish. So all of these children that come after through that Samaritan wife are not Jewish. So one of his children is somebody by the name of Aristobulus. And Aristobulus ends up also being killed by Herod because he thinks his son's threatening his power. And shortly after he's killed, his most promising son, Herod Agrippa, is taken and sent to Rome to be raised, as we said before, to be raised with the Roman aristocracy. So when Herod Agrippa goes to Rome, he becomes friends with people like Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, Nero, who, by the way, happen to be our next 4 Roman emperors. And we're going to see that he plays a very significant role with all of them. Now, it starts off not so good for him because the closest of all of these people we just mentioned is Caligula. Caligula was one of Herod Agrippa's best friends. Now, the story goes that Herod Agrippa was overheard one day saying that he looked forward to the day when Tiberius would meet his demise, would come to an end, would go to the world of truth, would die, because then Caligula could take over. Caligula was again, adopted son of Tiberius. But when word of this got back to Tiberius, who liked Herod Agrippa, he had Herod Agrippa arrested, didn't have him killed because he liked it, but he had him arrested because it was sort of a treasonous statement that was said. And then Herod Agrippa spends many years languishing in Roman jails. And that's our introduction to Herod Agrippa. Now, when we talk about the Christian Bible makes mention many times of someone named Herod. That is not our friend Herod from last week, Herod the Great. That is usually Herod Agrippa that we're talking about right now. Okay. At this time, when Tiberius is the emperor in Rome, Herod Agrippa, not sure what year it happened, if he was already in jail or he was just being raised in Rome, but the rabbis in Israel make a decision to take the Sanhedrin and move it off of the Temple Mount. In other words, the temple's still basically functioning at this point, but there's a lot of corruption even within the temple because of the Roman influence, because of their influence of basically giving the position of the high priest to the highest bidder. And therefore, the rabbis in this decision, in this process of separating the Jewish people from the state, they move the Sanhedrin from the Temple Mount, where it always was, to elsewhere outside of the temple compound. And they eventually stop trying capital cases and become focused on just the religious matters of the Jewish people. And that process starts in the year 29. Okay. Tiberius dies in the year 37. And the emperor that takes over for him is somebody by the name, we mentioned him before, of Caligula. Now, Caligula, there's a lot of different accounts of him. According to some accounts, he starts off as a pretty good emperor, but ends up just being extremely, how do we say this? Eccentric, to say this in the nicest way, but known for cruelty, sadism, extravagance, sexual perversion, and many people just associate him as an insane tyrant. Seems they didn't start off that way, but seems that he became that way. He and Herod Agrippa were very close friends, as we said, and so the day he's appointed as the emperor of Rome, he has Herod Agrippa released from jail, and he gives him a position back in Israel. So he goes from being in jail in Rome to being having a position of leadership in Israel. And he's probably starts off as one of the tetrarchs, and we're going to see as time goes on his rule gets stronger and stronger. But we see now that Herod Agrippa is back in Israel, probably starting off as one of the tetrarchs, eventually the ethnarch, and then we'll see eventually before the end of his career, he will be called king by the Romans. Now, Caligula, as we said, was quite an eccentric fellow, quite a crazy fellow in many ways, and part of his craziness, he wanted to have himself, or basically proclaimed himself as a god of the Greeks. He would come out to government events dressed as Hercules, Mercury, Venus, Apollo, the different Greek gods, and he wanted himself referred to as Jupiter. He was trying to take the place of being a Greek god. Now, as part of this, he insisted that every state in the Roman Empire should put a statue of himself into the religious houses of worship, the temples of those local states. And Judah was not excluded from this. So Caligula makes a decree that basically a statue of himself as the god that he proclaimed himself as needed to be put into the Beis Hamikdash, into the Jewish temple. Now, if you remember when we talked about the Hanukkah story, as we're right in the middle of Hanukkah right now, one of the things that the Greeks did that perverted the temple during their rule was they put a statue of Zeus into the temple. And now Caligula wants to do the whole thing all over again and put a statue of himself into the temple. So Herod Agrippa intercedes, and there's different accounts as to what happened. According to some accounts, Caligula wasn't happy about it, but he understood it could lead to a rebellion, so he backed off. According to other accounts, he was actually on his way to Jerusalem to make sure the policy of putting up the statue was upheld, and the statue would be upheld and put up. And it was at that time that he was assassinated by the Romans, who just couldn't deal with him anymore. After Caligula, the Roman Senate wants to make sure to have an emperor that will listen to them, that won't be as crazy and tyrannical as Caligula was. And one of the contestants for the position was somebody by the name of Claudius. Now, Claudius was also a friend of Herod Agrippa's. And according to some accounts, Herod Agrippa was instrumental in convincing the Senate to appoint Claudius as the emperor. And because of this, when Claudius eventually becomes the emperor, he further elevates his friend Herod Agrippa, gives him the title King of Judea, and gives him, it's not only puppet king, it gives him complete rule of the country. So that is how we see from the time of Herod, it go from being a king to with his son being not a king, and then after that, even nothing, to going back to having a king in place in Judah. Now, Herod Agrippa was a very interesting character because, as we've described, he was very much entangled with Rome. He was very Roman. On the other hand, he really tried to be a sincere Jew. He ingratiated himself with the rabbis. He let Judaism, to as much as it could at this time, flourish back in Israel. And we see in the Talmud, there's even a situation where he tried to perform certain rites of the king of Israel. One's called Hakel, where the book of Devarim is read on the holiday of Sukkot every 50 years, and every 8th year. And we see to a certain extent he was accepted by the rabbis. Now, there's some criticism given of those rabbis who accepted him, because technically he probably wasn't Jewish. His father was Herod. His father was he was the grandson of Herod. His father was, we said, Antipater. But through the mother, the maternal line was that of a Samaritan. His mother was probably also a Samaritan, or probably wasn't Jewish. And therefore, it's questionable. You know, we mentioned last week how Herod, therefore all his descendants, might have the status of being an Eved. So possibly he was an Eved. Maybe he was Jewish, maybe he wasn't. It's complicated. So the rabbis are criticized to a certain extent for praising him so much. But on the flip side, he was very good to the rabbis. So it's interesting that in this time period, tremendously tumultuous time period, we have certain rays of hope. And we have this king appointed by the Romans, and very much a part of Rome, who is very much for the rabbis and is able to keep the balance in the country. Now, this is one of those calms before the storm that we often see in Jewish history, where we need certain reprieve. We had this, with the king Yoshio in the first temple. We have certain reprieve for the Jews to be able to consolidate and solidify certain things before the exile comes. And so, therefore, a lot of the process of preparing for exile could happen under the rule of Herod Agrippa, even though it was only probably for a couple years that he was the out-and-out king, but before the destruction actually takes place. So that is one of the things that we see about Herod Agrippa, that he in many ways is remembered as a great person. When he dies, his son, Herod Agrippa II, takes over. And Herod Agrippa II, unfortunately, is a throwback to Herod. He does not even pretend to be a religious Jew like his father. He actually, according to many opinions, ends up marrying his sister at one point. And we're going to see that in the eventual war with the Romans, he will actually side with the Romans. He won't even side with the Jews. And so he is the last quote-unquote king of Judah, but there is nothing Jewish about him. We're going to see he is completely allied with the Romans. Okay. Now, at this time, as we talk more about the destruction next week, we're going to talk about a concept that is brought down, that sectarianism in Israel is rampant at this point. At this point, the Sadducees, the Sadducees, have made a comeback. There's many other groups. There's the Biryonim, there's the Secrecan. We have all these different groups we talk about that are all vying for power, that are all fighting one against the other. And when we talk about the destruction of the temple next week, we're going to talk about the core problem being sinas chinam, baseless hatred, because in many ways, it was a civil war. It's the internal fighting of Jew against Jew that will lead to the destruction of the Second Temple with all the different sectarian groups. One such group is a group known as the Aseans. Now, the Aseans lived probably somewhere down south near the Dead Sea. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were originally found, many thought they were the scrolls of the Aseans, but they are not. They're from a different people, known as the Qumran people or the Dead Sea people, a different sectarian group that had certain similarities to the Aseans, but were definitely not the Aseans. But there were certain traits of the Aseans that would sound familiar to us outside Judaism, in that, first of all, they were celibate. Now, that's not a great way to make sure your group is sustained by being celibate, but nevertheless, they were celibate. They believed you could not get married and procreate. They were very into going to the mikveh. They went to the mikveh many times a day, and they lived a life removed from physicality, removed from anything in society, and really a holier-than-thou type people, like the Jewish Taliban, if you will, maybe we can call them. Now, it is out of this group that quite possibly the early Christians were found. If John the Baptist existed, he was probably an Asean before he broke off, which is where he got his concept of celibacy for the religion, where he got his concept of baptism with all the mikveh use. And it is highly probable that John the Baptist started off amongst this group, the Aseans. Now, as we're talking about all these years, we mentioned Herod Agrippa taking the throne in 44. And if you think about the Christian calendar, according to the Christian calendar, Yashka, Jesus, was born in the secular year 0. That's why they call it AD, Anno Domini, the year of our God, the year that he was born. That's what they refer to as the common, what we call the common era. Everything before that was BC. Prehistoric, before Christ. Christ to them just means Mashiach, just means the anointed one, means the king. So they say that he was born in the year 0, or 1, or I guess he can't be born in the year 0, he was born in the year 1, and that he was crucified when he was around 30. So if we put that on top of our timeline here tonight, that would mean that Jesus was born the same year that Herod, the original Herod the Great, died, and that he lives his whole life during the Roman rule at least, of the end of Augustus Caesar into Tiberius Caesar, and that he has already gone before Caligula takes over. And it would seem that he is also in Israel after Herod Agrippa comes on the scene, but before he becomes king in Judea. That's what makes sense for everything we said tonight. Now, just from a timeline perspective, that doesn't really add up, because the Christian Bible regularly refers to Herod Agrippa, or Herod, as we said, as either the governor or the procurator or something, right, which is what he was in Judah. But that doesn't happen until Caligula becomes emperor, and that doesn't happen until the year 37. So already their dating is off. Now, in truth, that is not the worst of their dating. There are many historical issues, especially dating issues, the truth is, it always exists in antiquity to begin with. Let's face it, it does. It's always hard, even for us it's hard. I don't want to minimize that fact. But for the Christians, they have many other problems. And this problem starts with, we can look in two different places. When we talk about our history at this time, there are, I guess, two main sources of Jewish history that we're regularly pulling from. One is the rabbinic sources, the Talmud, the Midrashim, which were all being written down in this period. And the other is an account of somebody named Flavius Josephus, or Josephus Flavius. I'm never sure in Roman which one comes first. But Josephus was what we would call his first name, Josephus Flavius. And he's going to write an encyclopedic history of the Jews. Many writings. One book called Antiquities of the Jews, one book called The War of the Jews, and a few other as well, where he will write down the whole history of the Jewish people from the creation of the world up until the time period that he lived. lives. And he lives during the time of the destruction. He witnesses the destruction. He writes down everything about the destruction. So these are our main two historical sources that we have. If you are Roman, then you have Dio Cassius or Cassius Dio, depending on which way you go. And, that would be the main Roman historic source. Now, I don't know a lot about Dio Cassius. But one thing I can tell you is the Talmud has very few mentionings of Yashka, very few mentionings of Jesus, and none of them are positive. We'll get to those in a minute. Josephus, in its original form, has no mentionings of Jesus. In many of the editions we have today, you will find mentionings of Jesus, but scholars are almost in complete agreement that those were added in later by the Catholic Church, by their censors, or I guess in this case, we're adding something that's not really censorship, but they were later added in by the Catholic Church, and in the original accounts of Josephus, it makes no mentioning of Jesus. So we have mounting historical problems. First of all, with who they mention is the Roman governor in Judah, doesn't line up with the time period they say he lived. To be more problematic, the Jewish history being written at this time, if we go with Josephus, makes really no mention of him. And if we go with the Talmud, we have a different story. Because the Talmud mentions Yashka a few times. And one place it mentions him, it tells us his eternal punishment, that he eternally is burning in a vat of human excrement. That's his eternal punishment for all the Jewish bloodshed that has come in his name, and that's his eternal punishment. So not so favorable. One other mentioning, it might be the only other mentioning, tells us about somebody named Yeshu HaNatzri, who many say is Jesus. And the problem, historically, is that in the account given to us by the Talmud, it tells us that Yeshu HaNatzri is a student of Yehoshua ben Parachia. Now, you should remember that name, Yehoshua ben Parachia. We talked about him, I believe, last week or 2 weeks ago, that he was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time of the Maccabees. He was the one who established Hanukkah as a holiday in the year 139 before the Common Era. And the Talmud makes mentioning of this student of his, Yeshu HaNatzri, who ended up being extremely disrespectful, who he sent away, and he tried to come back a few times, but he never accepted him back. And he ends up basically saying that I'm done with Judaism, I'm done with the God of Israel, and I'm going out to start my own religion. If that is our friend Jesus over here, then we're not just off by a few years like we are with the dating of Caligula and Herod Agrippa, or we're not just off by maybe a few years longer, maybe because of Josephus or other issues. We could be off by a century and a half, and that is a problem for Christian scholars alike, because they have a timeline that they like to stick to, and it doesn't really fit. Now, one of the reasons why we could argue that possibly Jesus did exist much earlier, but the Catholic Church tries to postdate him and squeeze him into the time period of Herod, Agrippa, and so forth, is because we know the first of the Gospels were not written until the latter part of the first century. Matthew was the first of the Gospels, written somewhere around the year 40, maybe later. And if Matthew is the first of the Gospels, written in the year 40, it's fine. That's 10 years after they say Yashka lived. But if Jesus lived 139 before the Common Era, then Matthew never met Jesus. He was 170 years earlier. And that's a problem. So therefore, the Catholic Church has to come along and make sure to postdate him to get him close enough to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to the Gospels, so that the Gospels actually had some human interaction with Yashka. Okay, so that's our timeline issue with Yashka. Beyond that, don't you think if this man was walking around on the planet who was making such a ruckus and demanding that the Jews be better, or whatever the Christian Bible says, or trying to claim that he was the Messiah, or his followers were claiming he was the Messiah, or whatever it was, why wouldn't Josephus talk about it? Why wouldn't the Talmud talk about it? I mean, the Talmud talks about every problem the Jewish people have ever had. We know about all these sectarian groups. We know about the Sadducees. We know about our challengers. Even though we reject Jesus, if he was around making such a stink, why isn't he in the Talmud at all? Or, okay, these two little mentionings, but not really there. it's a big question when we talk about, did he either A, exist at the time period that Christian church says he did, or B, even existed at all? There are many scholars of the theory that the Jesus who was later created by the later Gospels, by the Gospels in general, Paul, who changed his name to Saul, is the one who's given a lot of credit for really creating the religion as we know it. And a lot of scholars say it was a composite character, that he took different legends, different people. He took that Yeshu, who is the student of Yeshua ben Parachia. He took somebody who was with the Aseans. He puts them all together, and he creates his messianic character of Jesus. That's what a lot of scholars think of the origin of Christianity and the origin of the Christian Savior. Now, from a Jewish perspective, the conversation of even Christianity as it develops, the conversation doesn't even start as to this being part of Judaism, as to Jesus being the Messiah. Because first of all, as we said before, there was already an heir apparent appointed from the house of Hillel as the position of Nasi. So how would some other Shmendrik have a claim to the throne? Number two, we see throughout the life of Jesus that he does not fulfill any of the requirements of being the Mashiach. As we said many times before, the Hebrew word Mashiach just means the anointed one. It means the king of Israel. Jesus was never king, right? And we don't even talk about him. So, and there wasn't even a king of the time period. There wasn't a king since maybe, you want to say Herod Agrippa was a king, maybe. You want to say the Hasmoneans were kings, maybe. But for the most part, there's never a king in the second temple. Since Tzidkiyahu in the first temple, there was never a king of the house of David of Judah. So he does not become the king of Israel in any way, shape, or form. No one even claims that in his time period. And not only that, but when we talk about all the messianic prophecies of there being world peace and lo yisagoy goy charav lo yimdo milchama, that there be no war and no swords being lifted and the spears being thrown down into plowshares and all that wonderful stuff that Isaiah the prophet talks about. Well, this was like the most tumultuous time in world history with the wars in Rome amongst themselves, the wars between the Romans and the Jews. Like, there's so much bloodshed. Like, this is the world after the Messiah came. So the way the Christians do is they say, second coming. He needed 2 stops to get it done. Okay. That is not a Jewish idea. Nowhere in Jewish liturgy do we have a concept of Messiah needing 2 stops on earth to be able to bring on the Messianic era. So philosophically, I've given many classes on this. You can go back and look at them if you're interested, where I go really into depth on this, that philosophically, there is no way that even if this character Jesus did walk the earth at the time the Catholic Church says he did, there's no way he could have even been taken seriously as a messianic contender, as a contender to the throne of Israel, which didn't really exist at this time. And therefore, and on top of that, we have all these other historical issues that pop up as to if he existed, when he existed, maybe he didn't exist. But that is the beginning of Christianity, if you will. This is the origins of Christianity. As we'll talk about in later sessions, Christianity really will start to develop as a religion in the coming generations after this point. Not as we see, nothing's really happening as far as Christianity in the first century. Whether it's a composite idea, like we said before, or it's just changing the dates around, who knows? But we're not going to see even Christianity develop within Judaism until maybe starting at the latter part, as we said, with Matthew and the Gospels in the latter part of the first century. But we're going to see they don't really gain steam until Rome gets involved with Constantine in the 4th century. That's when it really becomes a force to be reckoned with. So we'll talk about that more in coming sessions. I do want to finish with 2 more ideas on this topic. First of all, we're going to see that at this time, what we call the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, the Jewish prayer, is called the Shemona Esrei, which means the number 18, because it has 18 blessings. The only problem is if you stop to count, there's actually 19. And that is because in roughly the year 200, if you will, somewhere between 150 and 200, when Christianity does start to rise within Judaism and make a stink, the rabbis wanted to make a clear distinction between the Jews that were into Christianity and the Jews who weren't. So they added a blessing into the Amidah called V'lo Malshinim, which in our modern prayer book is called the blessing of heretics, which is really like a curse of heretics, which basically asks the Almighty to destroy all heretics. And the idea was that if someone would say this blessing, you knew that he was a sincere Jew. If someone wouldn't say the blessing, he was suspected as being an early Christian and was kicked out of the community. Okay. Now, I want to finish with one idea, and that is that there is a famous Jewish legend that I've even quoted before, and I've quoted this legend, and I finally got a little bit more to the bottom of it recently. And the legend is that out of the disciples of Jesus, there's one by the name of Peter. Peter's Hebrew name was Shimon. And there are those who say that Shimon, at the end of his career, left Christianity because he basically had a falling out with Paul. Paul thought it should be a religion for the masses. Peter thought it should be a religion for the Jews, and they should keep following the Jewish traditions. Paul thought the Torah didn't need to be observed anymore, and therefore, Jesus died, so therefore you don't need to follow the Torah anymore. So they had a falling out. Paul takes the religion to success, and Peter comes back to being Jewish and writes the prayer Nishmas that we say on Shabbos morning. This is a legend, and last year, a good friend of mine, Rav Yossi Quadrat, gave me an article they wrote on that to sort of clarify the whole situation. I'm happy to send the article to anyone who wants it, but the idea is thus. That first of all, Rashi says, anybody who says this idea, that Peter converted back to, or came back to Judaism and wrote Nishmas, has to bring a sin offering when the temple is rebuilt. He says, don't even say that. I don't have time to go too much into the details here, but Rabbi Quadrat brings the idea from a book called Toldus Yeshu HaNatzri, which means the history of Jesus of Nazareth, which is like a Jewish account as to what we think of Jesus. Now, I'll say this. First of all, there's many different editions of this book, number one. Number two, there's also timeline issues in this book, because it talks about Yeshua ben Prachi, as we mentioned before, as being Jesus' Rebbe, and it talks about Herod Agrippa, as we mentioned, and it also talks about Rebbe Akiva from the roughly, the year 130 of the Common Era. So my thought on that is that's the author's subtle way of saying the historical timeline is all out of whack and this is a fabrication, this book. Or this history is a fabrication. Now, in the book, it straight out says that his mother, Mary, was an adulteress, and she was married to another man, and Jesus was therefore a mamzer, was a bastard child. Like, it doesn't have favorable things to say about Jesus at all. But one thing it talks about a man by the name of Shimon HaKalfus. And Shimon HaKalfus is actually the uncle of Jesus, according to this writing. And it says that Shimon HaKalfus was instrumental in, so to speak, driving Christianity away from Judaism, as we mentioned before. And he did it by request of the rabbis. Now, there's someone else in this book, and in sort of some Christian thought, by the name of Shimon Kepa. The names are similar, Shimon Kepa and Shimon HaKalfus. But they're two different people, according to Rabbi Quadrat. Shimon Kepa was who became Peter. Shimon HaKalfus remained a sincere Jew, the uncle of Jesus possibly, and who was able to sort of infiltrate the ranks of Christianity and drive it away from Judaism. So suffice it to say, as much as we're discussing the first century of the Common Era in Jewish history at this point, it's not necessarily the right historical place to discuss the origins of Christianity, but we see from a Jewish perspective, from whatever way you look at it, this was never a movement, a force to be reckoned with, when Jesus was alive, if he was alive, when in this time period. It was something much later that came about and caused the Jews much complications going into the latter part of the first century, the second century, for sure the third and fourth century. And that's when we're really going to have to reckon with the early Christians, and we'll have the clean break from the Jewish people and the early Christians in later sessions, and we'll talk about it more as we go on. I thank you all so much for coming, and I thank you for listening.